Good morning. I'm Jeff Hammond, Executive Director at International Ground Source Heat Pump Association. Thank you so much for joining us for the January Dig Deeper webinar. This webinar is sponsored by Mission Geo, an initiative of GeoExchange, the Geothermal Exchange Organization, that will be working on raising awareness of the technology. So we thank Mission Geo for their sponsorship. Before we get started with our two great speakers this morning, I have just a few updates on IGSPA. So let's get right to those. This is our first Dig Deeper for January. We had our town hall earlier in the month, but if you'd like to speak at one of these webinars, we are still accepting abstracts for 2025, and we also still have advertising available. As you notice, Mission Geo is the sponsor of this one, so if you'd like your organization sponsorship here, these are recorded, and that sponsorship stays on the recording, so it's a great way to get the word out. Just go to IGSPA.org, go to training and events, and you'll find the abstract there. Contact us if you would like to advertise. Updates on the 2025 conference in conjunction with Geothermal Alliance of Illinois. That's coming up in about 6 weeks, March 11th through the 13th in Champaign, Illinois. Lots of things have happened since our last conference and since our last webinar even for updates. Our registration for the hotel, the block is full, but there are other hotels in the area. So don't worry, if you go to the website, you'll find the other hotels that are close to the conference center. The big thing, though, that I've highlighted in yellow is the pricing. Our early bird registration is only available through next Friday. After that, the price goes up. So if you haven't registered, you want to do that pretty quickly. We do have some sponsorships available still, and we certainly have conference program advertising available through next week. As far as the exhibit hall goes, all the booths are taken. I think we ended up with about 44 this year. We still have heavy equipment space available and tables in the lobby. So lots happening with the conference. Hope to see you in Champaign. These are our sponsors so far. We still have a few spots open, but we have a great appreciation for the sponsors that we have. We certainly could not do the conference without these sponsors. So thank you very much, conference sponsors. And like I said, there are some available, so feel free to contact us if you'd like to sponsor. This is our exhibit hall as it stands. Every booth has been taken. In fact, we even had to rearrange the exhibit hall a little bit to add more booths. So that's a great problem to have. And you'll see just a lot of very interesting exhibitors here. You'll be able to get your questions answered and have some great conversations. For the heavy equipment area, we have an area in the parking lot sectioned off, and we'll have heavy equipment as well as a table in the lobby. We have some additional tables for those who would like to exhibit but weren't able to get into the exhibit hall as well. And those are still good locations, but it's not actually a booth, it's a table. So you'll still have space there to talk about your products and services. GeoOutlook magazine, you should get an email actually Monday, I believe, for the January edition. If you're not getting our emails, please let us know at info@igspa.org because we have had some security challenges with organizations that are not letting our emails get through. So if you're watching this webinar and you're not getting IGSPA emails, please let us know. We'll work with you to make sure we can resolve that. This GeoOutlook magazine has a lot of great articles, and you'll want to make sure you get your hands on that. The next edition is July. We are now accepting advertising and articles for the July issue. And this is not just going out to the IGSPA audience. We've partnered with BNP Media. You may be familiar with the Engineered Systems, ACHR News, The Driller, Contracting Business, and so forth. So this actually goes out to their news and engineered systems audience, which is quite large. The combination of IGSPA and BNP News audience is over 50,000. So if you haven't advertised before, it's a great way to get the word out. If you have an article you'd like to write, there's quite a large audience to read that. Some of the new advantages to being a member and to going to our website are these project databases and licensing and CEU requirements. We certainly could use your help with filling out those databases. You're the local experts, so if you could go to the website and look for the About GSHPs menu. You'll find those two new databases, and the more information, the better it is for our industry as we grow. If you'd like CEUs for this webinar, just simply put your email and name in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will record those for you. When you log on to the member portal, you'll see the status of those. There is a new option for obtaining CEUs. If you're watching this live, you don't have to do anything. If you're watching this recording, you will need this code to submit for CEUs, but nothing changes if you're live. Don't worry about the code. It's just for recording. Couple housekeeping items here. We have two speakers today with great material I'll be introducing here shortly. So we will take questions at the end of their sessions. If you would put your questions in the chat or in Q&A, and I will read those after each of those sessions. It will be recorded, so you'll be able to view this later on. Just one more housekeeping item, and we'll get going here. We have had some attendees who cannot get to chat. You might have to click OK to allow your security settings to accept chat. If you can't do that, we've added Q&A, and most people can use Q&A. If neither of those work, raise your hand and we will unmute your microphone. But hopefully between chat and Q&A, you'll be able to ask your questions. All right, so just this disclaimer and potential conflict, and then I'll introduce our speakers. The upcoming presentation represents the opinion of the presenters and does not represent any official position, opinion, or endorsement of any products or services by IGSPA or its members. IGSPA town halls and Dig Deeper webinars are for member updates and education on the latest information in the geothermal heat pump industry and are not meant to endorse one technology or brand over another. It is the presenter's responsibility to disclose any conflict of interest or position that may arise in the content of the webinar. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Ryan, feel free to share your screen whenever that's convenient for you. Our first speaker is Ryan Dougherty, Executive Director of the Geothermal Exchange Organization, or GeoExchange, a national trade group representing the geothermal heat pump industry. He has extensive experience in public policy and governance, most recently serving as Deputy Director of the Illinois Healthcare and Human Services Framework. A decade in public service has helped inform his new role as an ambassador for the geothermal heat pump industry and building decarbonization, helping policymakers and energy professionals understand the technology's potential. After Ryan, we'll have Jacob Goldman, who's a lead AP certification. He's the vice president, of Energy Tax Savers. He has a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Buffalo and an MBA from the University of Maine at Urano. Jacob is the co-author of numerous articles published in Building Operating Management, Worship Facilities Magazine, UNIT Magazine, Green Lodging News, International Parking Institute, Corporate Business Taxation Monthly, and Thomson Reuters. He has presented to hundreds of corporations, architectural firms, engineering firms, accounting firms, and local chapters of USGBC, IFMA, BOMA, and AEE, as well as national conferences of NFMT, NALMCO, IGSPA, PEMA, and the EMC conference. Jacob has been a consistent speaker at GE's Nella Park and Cooper's The Source in Peachtree, Georgia. Lots of words to stumble over here. Sorry about that. So our first speaker, Ryan Dougherty, will be starting, and then we'll turn it over to Jacob. So go ahead, feel free to share your screen, and it's all yours, Ryan. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here. Good turnout. Hi, everybody. This is great. I think I was asked to do this a few weeks ago. I think it was Christine Hofer and Donna Kyler, Kathy Ridley, and Sally Stevens who put me up to it. And they chose a really kind of exciting and momentous week. So a lot to cover. Let me get into it. If you don't know GeoExchange, we are the voice of the industry in Washington and in many state houses around the country. Our primary focus is on policy and advocacy. But if you have heard recently about Mission Geo, we're really also engaged in building stakeholder awareness, forming partnerships with a range of like-minded organizations around the country. And we are a sister organization to IGSPA. They're really the yin to our yang, focused on workforce development standards, certification, and building the great workforce of the future that's going to support the growth of this industry. I work so closely with IGSPA. It's such a pleasure to talk to Jeff almost every day. And I'm really pleased to be here at the first Dig Deeper of 2025 to talk about what's going on in Washington. So this was a little over 2 years ago. Actually, it was August of 2022, so 2.5 years ago, really. It seems like just yesterday that then President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law. It was a long time coming. Remember, it was originally Build Back Better, and there was the whole reconciliation process, which is a congressional means of passing budgetary measures on a straight majority vote. You can do this once a year, and they got this thing through with very narrowly, with just Democratic votes. And then we were off to the races. It was rightly characterized as a historic law, one of the most aggressive pieces of legislation in world history on climate and energy and environmental issues. I think a lot of folks on the call are probably familiar with a lot of the provisions in the law. I won't spend too much time here, but my friend Jacob likes to talk about the amazing opportunities that are part and parcel of the IRA. There's a lot of money out there for all sorts of clean energy technologies, including ground source geothermal heat pumps. And we're already seeing it move the market in a lot of ways. I think the advancement of TENS and district systems and lots of commercial projects and increased interest on the residential side, a lot of that is being driven by the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, big credits for both commercial and residential building owners. I would be remiss if I didn't point to something really monumental in the law, which is the elective or direct payment for non-taxable entities. So for the first time, we're starting to see churches and schools and municipal buildings install systems and get money right from Uncle Sam for those projects. I know Jacob's been intimately involved in many direct pay projects, and lots of ETS's clients have seen checks flow to them in recent months. So Trump is back in the White House, and there was a lot of ink spilled in the press about how the IRA would be under attack in a second Trump presidency. So what does the future hold? Well, it changes by the hour, and nobody knows what's going to happen exactly. Your guess is as good as mine, and that concludes my remarks. So we'll take questions now. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. We're going to get into the details. There's lots of tea leaves to read. There is a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds, but we're going to dig into that here. But let's back up a little bit. What's transpired since the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act has been a long and winding process of IRA implementation. Lots of people were decrying the slow pace of implementation guidance from the IRS and Treasury on the mechanics of the law. How will it work in practice? What are the nuts and bolts? What are the processes by which you access the funds in the law? In November of 2023, Treasury announced a notice of proposed rulemaking on really the definition of energy property in the Section 48 tax credit. That's the investment tax credit for commercial projects. And what they were attempting to do here was really to frame out what is eligible, what's in, what's out, what can you claim on a project, and how does it work really? There have been some gray areas for many years about what you could and couldn't do to claim an ITC. Comments were submitted. There was a deadline in January of this year, and I was really bowled over by how many entities, organizations, businesses, utility companies who all kind of rose to the challenge and heeded the call that we put out to push back against some strange provisions in the proposed rule. In the rule, Treasury said you can't split a system. They introduced something known as functional interdependence, which was this new concept that essentially said you got to have all the parts and pieces of a system in order to claim the credit for that system. So you can't split a geo system. You can't have one taxpayer claim the credit on the ground loop and another taxpayer claim the credit on the heat pump. If that's the case and that's sort of the ownership arrangement, neither party can claim the credit nor any portion thereof. Well, this was a big deal for us because we're already starting to see, and we have been seeing for several years now, these sorts of business models proliferate where one entity, whether it be a municipality, a private entity, or a regulated utility, who wanted to own the ground loop, especially in district scale, sort of community style thermal energy networks. A lot of those business models are predicated on utility ownership of the loop, and then the customer businesses plugging into the loop and owning their own mechanical heat pump equipment. Well, this threw a big wrench in it, and we really rallied a lot of folks to the cause. I was buoyed by how many people weighed in, and all through this year, we continued to press DOE and Treasury on the issue. Uh, the final rule came out just last month, and it's interesting. I was in Washington at DOE's Deploy 24 event in early December, just a few days after the final rule was promulgated. And some of the policy staff at DOE came to me and were very curious about sort of industry reaction to the rule. And I joked with them, well, thank you for opening the door because they really reversed course in a way on that prohibition of split ownership. And I thank them for hearing us on that. But it is really interesting what they did here. They essentially said, they changed the example, which earlier had said, no, you can't split the system. If you do that, neither party can claim the credit. They said, well, if you've got a loop owner and that loop owner owns one heat pump that's connected to the loop, they can claim the credit on that loop. However, a commercial building owner that connects to the loop can't claim the credit on their heat pumps. Interesting. Well, they've preserved their theory of functional interdependence here in a strange way, but they did. And I joked with DOE staff, I'm going to invent a pocket-sized heat pump that you just plug right into the end of your billion-dollar thermal energy network, and you will have met the prerequisites of the rule, and you're off to the races. We'll call it the token heir. They thought that was pretty funny, but I think that's what it would take to meet the prescription here. Curiously, in the final rule, there's this language that's highlighted in the bottom snippet here that says, well, a residential home owner may be eligible for a credit under Section 25D. Maybe. This is the Treasury Department we're talking about here. Just tell us, are they eligible or not? Well, this final rule is focused on Section 48, so they were not going to render a verdict on 25D, the residential credit. It will be really interesting, and I think there will be test cases in the not too distant future about whether or not this is in or out. And we will be continuing to seek clarification around these issues in the coming months. Another key implementation issue centered on domestic content. There in the IRA, there are bonus credits available for a range of things, most notably energy communities and domestic content. You can get an additional 10% ITC if your equipment, your system is largely comprised of domestically sourced components. They came out with an initial set of guidance in May of 2023 on this topic, and there was a lot of hue and cry from all quarters. Everyone was upset about Notice 2023-38 because it required manufacturers to reveal their input costs of equipment. So for a heat pump manufacturer, they would have to tell their customers, well, we got the compressor and the the circuitry and controls and steel. Here's all the parts and pieces of our unit. But we also have to tell you what we paid for everything. And that was a non-starter. A corporation is not going to reveal proprietary competitive information to customers or to the IRS. And so a year later, in May of last year, they came out with superseding guidance, which said, okay, if you can't get the input costs and sources of origin for the equipment that comprises your system, we're gonna give you an easy button here. We're gonna give you a much simpler way to claim the domestic content bonus credit, and that's through the use of safe harbor tables. And in Notice 2024-41, they introduced the first set of safe harbor tables, which really only focused on solar, wind, and batteries. They said, just line up your project against the ratios in this table and go down the sheet and say yes, domestic, no, foreign. And if the domestics add up over the required threshold, then you're home free. And they said in the notice, if you're not wind batteries or solar, tell us how we should do this for you. Well, we got to work and we submitted our own safe harbor table. We met with Treasury, we met with DOE. They said, wow, this is really impressive. You've done a lot of homework here. You've broken down all the parts and pieces of a system. What the screenshot that I posted in this slide is just the top portion of the table. If you go and look on regulations.gov at what we submitted, it's a very extensive table that comprises multiple different kinds of systems, both central plant systems and distributed systems. We were hopeful that before the Biden administration transitioned, they would issue additional guidance. They did come out with more guidance just a couple weeks ago, but it was just tweaks to what they came out with in May. This is an issue for us because, and Jacob can testify to this, next
Ryan,
year.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I've had a couple comments in the chat. I think your camera's off, so people don't know who's speaking. Sorry to interrupt.
My apologies.
No trouble.
Sorry. Hey, I'm back. So we're going to continue banging on this. This is the dust is not settled here. We've heard from the Republican incoming Congress that that domestic content is going to be a big focus of the future of the ITC, and there very well could be additional guidance that that could implicate the domestic content for future ITC eligible projects. I was going to say that Jacob can attest to the fact that next year, to get a direct payment for a non-taxable entity, you have to prove out that you meet domestic content requirements. Right now, there's no easy path for us to do that in the form of a safe harbor table. We are going to make that issue abundantly clear to the Republicans. Let's talk now about what has transpired in the last week, because I've gotten a lot of people reaching out to me saying, Did Trump just kill the tax credits? No, he did not. You need to understand what executive orders can and can't do. Executive orders are they give the authority and the latitude to a president to direct federal agencies in certain ways. It's Trump telling all of the agencies under his authority to do or don't do things. And I think in some ways, he's stretching boundaries of what might be legally permissible with executive orders. This is a question for the courts, but as of now, the tax credits are not changed. Congress would have to act and affirmatively pass a new law to modify or repeal any of the tax credits. Let's look at a couple key executive orders that came out this week. The first is the declaring a national energy emergency executive order. This is largely a directive to executive agencies to double down on certain types of energy and energy development. And it's the drill baby drill executive order. He's telling the agencies, look at the Clean Water Act, look at the Endangered Species Act, and see how those laws could potentially slow exploration for a set of energy resources, which are defined in the executive order. One of the definitions of energy in the EO is geothermal heat. Now, you could argue they're talking about high temp electricity production when they say that. I don't know that. I certainly am going to go to Washington in a few weeks and say thank you for recognizing the heat that is pulled out of the ground in heating mode and delivered to buildings. We're going to hang our hat on this, and I think that we ought to recognize that geothermal may be a preferred technology for this administration. The other executive order, the Unleashing American Energy executive order, is the one that got a lot of press and got people anxious because there's a pause in it on and in the EO it's called terminating the Green New Deal. Well, that's a little odd because the Green New Deal was legislation sponsored by uh, a couple Democratic legislators several years ago. And so this really what he's trying to do is pause IRA and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding. And then already we've seen a bit of a reversal on this. They came out with a clarifying executive order that said, no, we didn't mean like we're going to kill all the road and bridge projects. We're pausing anything going out the door on the IRA and those sorts of programs. It's important to understand too what they can and can't do. There's money. The IRA really was comprised of a couple different things. One is the bucket of appropriations and what was appropriated like in the form of rebate programs. So the state energy rebate programs, which were funded by the IRA to the tune of $8.8 billion and will flow through state energy offices. Some of those funds have been called into question. Are they really going to go out the door? Are they obligated? Are they fully contracted? That is a question that circles around this 1974 law from during the Nixon era, where Congress said, no, if we appropriate it, you have to send it out. And there's going to be a big fight brewing on this in the coming months. I want to make sure to get to Jacob, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit. What's coming down the pike next is the tax Super Bowl. This is the big reconciliation process. The same way they did the IRA, they're going to use that to do all sorts of things. Border security, disaster relief potentially. The big thing they want to do is an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act the 2017 law that the first Trump administration kind of shepherded through and signed into law. That's expiring at the end of this year, those big tax cuts. And a key priority of this Congress is to extend those tax cuts. They have to find money to pay for all that stuff. And this past Friday, the House Ways and Means Committee came out with a long laundry list of pay-fors. How are they going to fill a $4 trillion hole in the deficit? Well, they're going to repeal things. And one of the things, some of the stuff that's in the top line menu are the IRA credits. But it's going to be much easier said than done. Last year, a number of Republicans caused a lot of angst in the House Republican caucus because they wrote to Speaker Johnson and said, the Inflation Reduction Act is terrible, but we kind of like some parts of it. You should preserve the stuff we like. Just this week, more Republicans said we should tweak stuff here and there, but we should probably keep the credits around. If I were to bet what is going to happen later this year, and I should say, the fact that they're just coming out with the menu of offsets, and Speaker Johnson is talking about working group sessions, they're behind the curve on reconciliation. Initially, they said they wanted it done by Easter. That's not going to happen. It will probably be much later this year, October, if I had to guess, when they will put this together. There's still an outstanding question about how they do it, whether it's what the Senate Majority Leader would like to do, a sort of a two-step approach like they did with the IIJA and IRA in 2022, or do they do what Trump wants to do, which is one big beautiful bill, as he's called it. That's still evolving, and so we're going to see how this plays out. But rest assured, we're going to be in Washington consistently over the coming months, advocating on behalf of the industry and helping Congress and the administration understand the incredible potential around this technology. This is an American industry born out of the oil and gas industry. It is a common sense HVAC solution that delivers energy independence, grid resiliency, and by the way, it happens to be very environmentally friendly as well. So lots more to come. We will be here to answer questions both today and beyond. And I'll just, in closing, just say building decarb, it's not going away. The states are already thinking about what they can do to mitigate effects of the Trump administration in this Congress. It's going to be a wild year. I'm kind of excited for it, though. And I will stop there way over time. Jacob, pass it over to you and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I don't have any questions in the chat just yet, but I'll continue to watch the chat and the Q&A, and then we will have additional questions after Jacob's presentation. Thank you, Ryan. All yours, Jacob.
I think you're muted, Jacob.
Jeff, can you see my slides?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. So the QR code will go to a much larger presentation. So if you shoot that QR code, it'll create an email, and you just hit send, and then it'll auto send you the slides. People of the future, if you're watching this on the recording, the QR code also works in the future. So if you're in the future, press the QR, take a picture of the QR code, it'll still work. It'll send you the latest set of slides. The big news is the checks are flowing. The checks are flowing. And we're going to show you a slide of some of the checks we've seen for ground source. We're going to talk about some of the changes that happened in December. We're going to talk about the start of construction and placed in service. Could be topics that you need to really understand, because certain parts of the law can be based off of start of construction. Other parts of the law can be based on placed in service. We'll touch on 179D. The reason we're going to touch on 179D is because the Department of Energy has opened up a new portal. I'm going to just give you a short, blink of it, but we're going to take a look at what DOE has to offer with this new 179D portal. So this is really just an update. It's not the full presentation. It's just an update on some things that have changed. But we're going to start with that, with the celebration. Here's a sampling of people that have actually gotten checks. These are our elective pay, some of our elective pay clients. We have some school districts that have ground source, millions of dollars of ground source tax credits. They received the actual check. I saw a picture of the check, and they put that right into their accounts. These started flowing in November, and every week we're getting more and more of our clients are seeing checks flowing. And some of them are school districts, some of them libraries, some of them cities, some of them towns. But the checks are flowing. This is real. A lot of people before November were wondering, well, is this ever going to happen? Is it really real? It is real. There's actual checks flowing. People have actually received checks. This has been a tremendous opportunity, specifically direct pay or elective pay, whatever you want to call it. Those checks are now flowing to not-for-profits. They're flowing to government entities, and they're taking advantage of these incentives for the ground source projects, not to even mention all the solar projects and thermal storage projects that we do as well. The law had final regulations, as Ryan mentioned, in December. The final regulations came out on Section 48. There were some great changes. So you might recall that you had to define what is a single energy property, and you had this list of 7 factors that helped you decide if the things that you were doing are one single energy property or could be split up into separate ones. Well, it used to be 2 out of 7, and now they've moved it to 4 out of 7. So 4 out of 7 of these have to be true in order for you to combine projects. Where were we having problems with this in the before? It's when a brand new building was built with ground source and solar. Oftentimes that ground source and solar had to be added together because 2 of these factors were true. Well, now with a 4-factor requirement, less and less projects are having to be combined. So that was one big change that came out of the guidance that came, they're not guidance, the final regs that came out in December. So that was a big change. And so now less projects have to be combined. As everybody knows, ground source is one of the few technologies that is specifically advantaged by the legislation in that all the distribution, let's say you built a brand new building, you put a conventional package unit on the roof, you attach that package unit to ductwork, VAV boxes, diffusers, all that internal inside the building stuff would not qualify. All the stuff that distributes the energy throughout the building would not qualify. But you take that package unit off, you put in ground source, and now magically all that distribution now qualifies. And there was a topic called dual use equipment. So let's say that energy that's flowing through that ductwork, for example, is not just coming from the ground. It's also coming from another source like an electric boiler or a gas boiler. Well, then that's dual use property. You can only take it up to the percentage. And there's this 50% cliff. So if your energy is mainly coming from the gas boiler, then that equipment doesn't qualify if it's more than 50%. But if the ground is providing more than 50%, well, then you're good. Now, the numerator for that calculation, that 50% calculation, was ground source energy divided by total energy flowing through whatever dual use equipment we're talking about. In the guidance that came out, the final regs that came out in December, somebody earlier on had a comment about what do you do about simultaneous heating and cooling? Before the final regs came out, we were taking simultaneous heating and cooling, a heat pump that is just taking energy from one part of the building and dumping it into another part of the building and not using the ground. We were taking that as part of the ground energy and putting it in the numerator. In the guidance, unfortunately, they directly stated that that energy does not count It stays in the denominator, but it does not go in the numerator. So more and more equipment than expected is now dual use equipment. Also, unfortunately, in the guidance, in the final regs, they made a specific point to say that using the ground to heat domestic hot water is not an eligible project. So the portion of your project that's heating the domestic hot water, that portion of the project does not qualify for a tax credit. You have to be heating the structure. Heating hot water is not an eligible project for potable water, water that's going to a shower, water that's going to a sink. That portion of the project would not be eligible. That's another unfortunate item that came out in the final regulations. Thermal storage, some people are using thermal storage definitions to qualify ground source. There was one big change in the thermal storage. They did say that the system must be big enough to store at least 1 hour of the building's load. Now, they didn't specify what hour of the building's load. So, 1 hour of the building's load in September is a lot different than 1 hour of the building's load in August. But we're thinking they probably meant peak load. So the annual peak load, the system needs to provide at least 1 hour. Now, this is never a problem for ground source because the ground clearly has that storage capacity. But if you do thermal storage on the side, there were some people going around talking about, well, are the pipes thermal storage because they store the energy? Is the heat pump itself thermal storage? And the answer now is no, because those parts of the system do not store 1 hour of the building's load within their vessel or what have you. So that was an item that came out in the final regulations that came out in December. Okay. Very important topic, start of construction. Ryan mentioned that in 2026, you need to meet domestic content for elective pay. If you're bigger than 284 tons, you would have to meet domestic content. That's why some people are trying to do start of construction in 2025. So what do you need to meet the start of construction? Well, there's two different ways that you can meet start of construction. One is called the physical work test. The other is called the 5% safe harbor. So the physical work test is there has to be physical work being done on the job site. That physical work cannot be site prep, surveying, permitting. It has to be physical work. And we believe that a test borehole is not, we think that fits under surveying. It does not fit under actual physical work. So therefore, what is physical work typically for a ground source project? It's starting to drill the bore field. If you start drilling out 3, 4, 5 different boreholes, then you've started physical work. And as long as you finish your project within 4 years of when that started, then you're okay. You meet the safe harbor, you meet the physical work test. That is the easier test to meet. But it does require you to actually doing physical work, and most likely on a ground source project, that's going to be starting the drilling of the bore field. The other way to qualify is a little more complicated. It's called the 5% safe harbor. The reason it's tricky is there's different accounting systems. There's what's called a cash-based system, which almost no organization uses, and that would be if you expended 5% of eligible costs. Now, let's say you're building a new building and you spend money on the walls and the columns and the beams. Well, that's not ground source eligible. You have to be spending money on the eligible project, on the ground source project itself. So if you're a cash-based accounting system, all you have to do is send out of your bank account and send it to a vendor 5% of the eventual total project cost. We never recommend spending 5% in a cash-based accounting. We recommend 6 or 7 or 8 because projects do sometimes go over budget. And when they go over budget, that 5% turns into 4.9%, and now you didn't meet this 5% safe harbor. But most accounting is accrual-based accounting. And accrual-based accounting is you have to actually accrue the expense. So you have to, sometimes in accrual-based accounting, you have to have received the services for you to owe the money. So it's important to make sure that your customers have accrued the 5% if you're trying for the 5% safe harbor. I always recommend the physical work test. because it's more straightforward. It's easier to prove. But if you have to, you go the 5% safe harbor, but make sure your customer is actually accruing the 5%, because accrual does not necessarily occur when you just make your payment. Sometimes something has to be delivered for accrual, and the only way you'll know is by talking to their accounting department, their tax department, their finance department, what have you. So start of construction, very important topic, because you need to know that to place when your project was started, because a lot of these laws are based on start of construction. On the flip side, there's placed in service. So, placed in service for solar is kind of straightforward. It's when you receive the permission to operate from the utility. It's when the utility lets you turn that meter backwards. So that's placed in service. But for ground source, you kind of have to borrow from, new construction. So a TCO, a temporary certificate of occupancy, is a great indication of placed in service. A C of O, another indication. If those aren't in the lingo of the project that you're working on, then substantial completion, a document that the building owner signs off saying that they accept the building and that it is substantially complete. Sometimes commissioning documents would prove out placed in service. So placed in service is the year you get to take your tax incentive. When your project is placed in service, that tax year is when you get to take your tax incentive. So that could be important as well. Really quick on 179D, I just want you to be aware that 179D exists. It's available for designers, for government and not-for-profit buildings. It's available for commercial building owners. It is a tax deduction. It is not a credit. So it is a tax deduction. We've done lots of projects. I think it's at 17,000 projects with 179D. There were some changes to 179D. So it used to be $1.80 per square foot. That actually drops to 57 cents to $1.13. But if you do your installation with prevailing wage and apprenticeship, it goes up to $2.83 to $5.65. And there are now two ways to qualify. One is called the traditional pathway. That's energy simulation modeling against a reference building. In this case, ASHRAE 90.1 2007. Then there's an alternative pathway, which is EUI, energy use intensity. And that's where you have to show the 25% to the 50+% in order to get the higher end of the incentive. And the reason I want to point out the traditional pathway and alternative pathway is because I want to share with you the 179D portal that was created. But before I share it with you, I just want to tell you, when you open up the portal, it has this language depending on if you're going traditional pathway or alternative pathway. So the first one says, for the traditional pathway, the 179D portal may not be relied upon for any purpose in claiming the 179D deduction or in supporting an existing claim. Any information generated by the 179D portal is solely for the purpose of creating an estimate and cannot be relied upon to establish any requirement of 179D. So what's DOE doing here? It's a first step. It is more than likely that they're working with IRS to try to get the portal to be an eligible way to file for these things. But right this second, it is not an eligible way to file for these things. So they're putting out a marker, and hopefully sometime soon they'll be able to call that marker in and actually use it for actual filing purposes. The same language is almost identical on the alternative pathway, which is that EUI may not be relied upon for claiming the 179D deduction. With that, I'm just going to quickly just show you somewhere I have this open. Do I not have it open anymore? Oh no. Hold on. Here it is. So this is, after you log in, you're given two choices: traditional pathway, alternative pathway. For ground source, you're not going to be too excited about the traditional pathway, unfortunately. The reason being is your technology, and I'm just going to go to one that I created for our offices here. The first part is there are only two different building types that you can have: office and small retail. So this only covers office and small retail. And when you go to the HVAC section, these are your only choices. You'll notice ground source is not one of them. So these are your only choices. You got to put in some information, and then you can move forward and go to the next screen. And then you could, now here you could potentially trick your system, using the efficiency of your system. You could potentially trick your system into making it as if it was a ground source system. But it's interesting to play with these numbers. You can kind of see how little envelope really moves the bar. So we played with the numbers a little bit. On the other pathway, this pathway is for retrofits and retrofits only. So if you're doing a ground source project on a retrofit, you can go the alternative pathway. What I would tell you is it requires you to separately fully log into Portfolio Manager, Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and you have to put all your utility bills in for pre-project and post-project. So it is a Portfolio Manager driven pathway to qualify. And with that, I will go back to my slides. Where are they? And if you want a copy of the slide deck, you can go to the QR code on the right. If you want to just put my contacts in your cell phone, you can go to the QR code to the left. And with that, I'll open it up to questions to Ryan and myself.
Thanks so much, Jacob, and thank you, Ryan. We do have some questions. Ryan has responded to a number of the Q&A postings there. So if you've asked a question in Q&A, you might check the responses. Thank you, Ryan, for doing that. We also have some in chat, and the first one that I see here for either Ryan or Jacob is in regard to direct pay. Would you guys say that direct pay is in more danger than the tax credits themselves?
Well, let's qualify this, because direct pay is law. It's part of the IRA. It's on the books. You can claim it. Here, something that's interesting is one of the executive orders that was promulgated was announced a hiring freeze at the federal level. Somebody told me earlier this week that there is a super duper, I haven't substantiated this, but there's a super hiring freeze at the IRS. There is a growing fear that they could kind of strangle bandwidth at the agency in order to slow walk credit monetization in the form of transferability or elective direct pay. Is that going to happen? We don't know. But they're looking to keep money in the federal treasury in order to pay for an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That may be a workaround they may take on. I don't know if Jacob has thoughts on that. It's all conjecture at this point.
Yeah. So maybe the way we think of things is not necessarily on, like, we always are planning. We're planning for potentialities. So how would you plan if you did have a belief system that they were going to do that? They were going to get rid of elective pay. By the way, once again, I reiterate what Ryan said. They cannot get rid of it by executive order. It would have to pass Congress. Congress would have to vote. The House and the Senate would both have to vote on it, and then the president would have to sign it to get rid of elective pay. But let's say that were to happen. More than likely, if that were to happen, it would be based on the concepts of start of construction. Oftentimes what they would do is they would say, if your start of construction is done, if you start construction before the end of the year, you're locked in, you get the incentive. But if you start next year in 2026, then there's no incentive for you. So what is that? And by the way, I pick end of the year. It could be the day the law passes. It could be 60 days after the law passes. It could be 90 days after the law passes. So what does that mean to do? It means get your project started, because potentially, I'm not guaranteeing this, but potentially start of construction could be a way to lock in these savings. Alternatively, they could use placed in service as the requirement. And they could say everything placed in service in 2025 is good, but if you place it in service in 2026, it's bad. So if you have projects under construction right now, let's get them finished. Finish them as quickly as you possibly can, because place in service might be the way that you lock it in. So these are the types of things in the small chance. First of all, there's only, I don't know what it is, Ryan, you probably know better than me, 3-person majority or 4-person majority in the House. We're all focused in on IRA and Section 48 and elective pay. But it takes only 4 people to block the legislation. There could be somebody that's interested in state and local taxes that doesn't like what the rules are and block the legislation. There's about 100 different, maybe 1,000 different tax items that could be the reason that any one of the Republicans could want to block that legislation. So there's a lot of, I think it's going to be a lot harder to get rid of things than people think. And I don't know if Ryan agrees with that.
Yeah, great comments, Jacob. And you and I have traded emails on all the world of possibilities on what they could or couldn't do to the IRA. It would be absolutely unprecedented for them to say, if you started construction on a project, you're not going to get a credit. That would be incredibly disruptive to the economy. And I cannot envision any circumstance where they would go back and say, you've broken ground, you're not good. So we need to, I know customers are extremely risk averse and unknowns are not palatable to them. But what Jacob said about starting projects is very good. The other thing I'll say is that it is a very narrowly divided Congress, particularly in the House. We've seen just this week a number of House Republicans come out and assert and affirm their support for keeping these credits around. If I were a betting man, I would say if they're going to fiddle with the IRA and its provisions around tax credits, they will likely accelerate the sunset. Is it going to be next year? No, I would say they would probably say, okay, we understand that there's all these projects out there. The money is flowing, particularly to red states. The majority of these IRA dollars are going to Republican states and districts. They, instead of saying, okay, the thing ends in 2035, which is the current end date for these provisions, they'll say, okay, we're going to go to 2030 or 2029, and we'll start sunsetting there. They save a bunch of money on the back end in order to pay for the tax cut extensions, but they still allow all the projects that are in the pipeline to move forward. If I were going to bet, I would think that's what might happen.
Boy, this is a really good discussion, and I've been reading through the chat and the Q&A. It looks like you two guys have addressed virtually all of these questions, so I really appreciate your time. And if you submitted a question in Q&A, Ryan typed in a lot of those responses as well. So,
and Jeff, if I could just revisit a couple of those that were asked in the Q&A. Tom Wire asked, "What can we do?" It's a great question, and yes. I think one of the key things that GeoExchange will be engaged in is showing and telling. We've been doing this for years now. Highlighting great projects and taking members of Congress to projects. There's no better way to get a champion for the technology than by taking them to a project site and showing them what is happening. But I think lifting up some of these projects, it's both the curse and the blessing of the technology. It's out of sight, out of mind, quiet, consistent, but it's also like kind of hidden, right? And so we have to really lift up some of these projects and say, you may not have known about this church or school or headquarters or fire station. We need to put those in front of Congress and say, this great stuff is happening, and it's empowering our economy, it's strengthening our grid, it's reducing emissions, putting people to work. Those arguments win the day, and that's why we are beloved on both sides of the aisle already.
For sure. Excellent. Well, being respectful of everyone's time, I'm showing about 11:31 Central Time. So this was a great discussion. Thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you so much, Jacob. Any parting words before we head out?
Yeah, I'll see everybody in Champlain. So we're looking forward to it. I think both of us are speakers in Champlain, so we look forward to seeing you all in person.
Yes, yes, at the University of Illinois. IGSPA conference coming up just in a few weeks. Second week of March. If you be there or be square, there's going to be a lot more dialogue about these topics, and it's going to be a fantastic confab. So look forward to seeing you at the U of I.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great weekend. See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.